Hello, Tom. Thank you for being here today. Your MBT theory concludes that we live in a virtual reality, so reality equaling information. Now, you offer as part of the MBT Immersive, both the live and the online, a session involving accessing databases. Your metaphors for recorded information in this virtual reality are called databases: past, unactualized past, present, future probability. Now, you've meticulously researched how this information, which is key to a virtual reality concept, works. So could you describe and give us some examples of each and how you tested them out?
Okay. Well, first of all, let me just give a very short idea of why these databases exist anyway. I mean, what's the point of them? You go back into Hindu theology and Buddhist theology, and you'll find Akashic records mentioned there. These folks knew that there was a database because they also collected data from databases. And we know that there's a database there because that's how remote viewers work. And we know remote viewing is a real thing. There are people who are very good at it. So that data just comes out of a database, and people see auras, and that's just data out of a database. And people do diagnostics out of databases. We know some people are very good at their hunches and their feelings and their intuition, and some people are horrible at their intuition. They're wrong most of the time when they have this gut hunch, the feeling. They're not very good at it, but some people are very good at it. And where is that information coming from? And we have people with precognitive dreams. They will dream things that then come true later. And there's enough of this has been recorded to make it a fact. It's been studied and it's a fact. So if these things happen, where does that information come from? Where is that available to them, to remote viewers, to people doing precognitive dreams? And where do they get this? Well, the generic answer is you get data from a database. You get information from a library, right? You get information from an information source. Well, why does this database exist? Is it just there for us to have fun so people can learn how to see auras? No, that's not the point. It has to be there in order for our reality to be rendered. Because the way you render new measurements, something new is measured. Okay, something we don't know. That's why we make a measurement. If we knew everything, we wouldn't need to measure anything because we'd already know exactly all the details about everything. But we don't know a lot of things. So we make measurements. And a measurement can be something as complicated as, an electron microscope looking at a tiny thing, or it could be something as simple as, going up into the attic at grandma's house to see what's there. It's all just making a measurement, seeing what's there when nobody really knows. That information's not available. Grandma doesn't know what's up there. She hasn't been in the attic, for 30 years. She has no idea the kind of stuff that might have been left up there. So if she doesn't remember it, then nobody really knows who might have put it up there. Maybe movers put it up there when they moved into that house, 40 years ago from some other place. Who knows? So nobody knows. So when you go up and you walk up into the attic and start looking at things, now the system has to know what to put there. You dig a hole in the ground, the system has to know what's there. You measure something that's unknown. You open your refrigerator door after you've been away from home for a month or two. You don't remember what's in there. So that's a measurement, and it's measuring the unknown. System has to put something there in those instances. It has to render something. You're not going to pull open a refrigerator door and find, a big black hole, with nothing there because the system didn't remember what was in there. The system will put something in there, you see. So that's the way our system works, is it takes a random draw from a probability distribution of the possibilities. That is how the system puts things when there is a measurement of something unknown. So there's possible things that could be in there. All the possible things have probabilities. Some things more probable than others. Okay, you go into grandma's attic, and let's assume grandma just passed away. So that's why you're going into her attic, because you're going through all her house and things to get her, to clean it up for sale. So you go up there, and there's certain things that are more likely than others to be there. There's some things that would be very improbable to find in grandma's attic. You probably wouldn't find a locomotive up there because that just wouldn't make any sense. There's a lot of things that wouldn't make any sense. You probably wouldn't find a car up there or a horse. None of those things are very high probability being in grandma's attic, but there are other things that do have probability. Maybe grandma was a painter, and maybe you'll find some old paintings up there. That's a higher probability. So anyhow, all the possibilities with their probabilities, then you take a random draw from that distribution. From the distribution, it means the things that are more likely to come out of that random draw. So you take a random draw from that distribution, and that's what the system puts there. And that's because our system is, our virtual reality is basically a probabilistic virtual reality, not a deterministic virtual reality. So when there's nobody who knows what's in grandma's attic because grandma died and nobody else has been up there for 30 years, then there's a lot of unknowns. The system can just put things there that make sense. That's that random draw out of the probability distribution, and that's what it does. That's the simplest thing for it to do. That's all it has to do. It doesn't have to go back and scan all the records to see everything that may have gone into grandma's attic and everything that came out of her attic out of the last 30 years. That would be a lot of trouble. It's easier just to put up there what is likely to be there, because what is likely comes out of this random draw from the probability distribution of the possibilities. So anyway, that's the way it works. Well, in order for the system to know what the possibilities are and the probability of those possibilities, it needs to do a lot of that calculation up front, because 7.5 billion of us, and we make measurements all the time by opening doors and going places and putting, shoveling the ground. We do all these things all the time. So the system needs to have those probabilities kind of waiting for it when those things come up in the probable future. You see, so when you're getting close to do a construction project, then that's going to dig a big hole with a big bulldozer or something, then the system needs to start thinking about what might be there, because it's going to have to know that. So it starts developing all of that ahead of time. So this database that it develops that enables it then to do these probability distributions of the possibilities whenever it needs to, it does that ahead of time. That's what I call the probable future database. And it can work ahead of time as much as it likes. Now, when it does that, those probabilities can change. Probabilities can change a whole lot. What's up there, in grandma's attic. Maybe grandma had the grandchildren over a week before she died, and the grandchildren went and played in the attic. Well, that may change a lot of things. A lot of things that were up there may not be working anymore. It may be broken, or, maybe they were taken. Maybe the grandchildren took them home. We don't know. So now there's unknown things that it didn't plan for, and it has to make adjustments. So there's this always being adjusted probable future database that the system needs in order for it to be a very efficient rendering engine. So when it's time to render something, when somebody makes a measurement, it doesn't have to start from scratch. It already has, say, 80 or 90% of the work already done. It just has to clean it up, look at some changes, and go with it. Most of the hard work is done already. So that's why you have a database for the future probabilities. Now, as time goes on, the future turns into the present and then the past. Okay, now the present is just when everything happens. It's just one delta t where everything happens. So once it goes past and into the past, that creates the past probable database, everything that could have happened and the probability it would have. And then what we actually do, our history, is a thread that just runs through this probable past database. Okay, so that's why we have the databases. The system has to make the future probable database in order to be efficient in rendering the virtual reality. Then that future probable just turns into the past database, past, that's been actualized, which is our history, in the past that hasn't been actualized, which is all the things that didn't happen that could have. So it just is already there. There's no reason for the system to throw it away. It's already there, so it keeps that. So that's why we have the databases. They're there for a reason. It makes the rendering more efficient for the system to do that.
What is the significance and the value of the unactualized past database? You have the past recorded, that's kept intact to monitor change.
Well, the past is kept and not erased just because you can learn a lot from the past. The past is a very valuable information to know. There's what's the saying about if you don't have history, then you keep making the same mistakes over and over again. You learn from your past, and you often don't learn right at the moment that it becomes past. It's often on reflection later that you learn from the past. So the past has valuable information in it. So it's already there, and we can, well, another thing is that the past is pretty much what most of us would call the present, because the delta t that's different, you have the past, then you have the present, and then you have the very first future probable, which is 1 delta t, 1 times 10 to the minus 44 seconds into the future. And the past is 1 times 10 to the minus 44 seconds into the past. Well, 1 times 10 to the minus 44 seconds is a very small amount of time. So that probable future starts, right up against the present, very, very small increments. And that past database goes right up to within 5 to the 10, or 1 times 10 to the minus 44 seconds of being at the present moment. So when we talk about the past, that's just, what, nanoseconds away. Nano, I guess, seconds away from the present. So the past is pretty present, particularly from our view of it. So that past database is really up to date and current, yet it flows from there all the way down. So that's why we can use that past database to view what we're remote viewing, because it's really goes right up to the present moment, you see. And that's why we can use it to look at auras of people. We can use it to do diagnostics. So we kind of think of that as we're looking into the present, but it's not really. We're looking into the past, but just barely the past. So that's why it's useful, gives us a lot of good information. And because we're in consciousness, we have access to all of that. We can access that through our intuitive side rather than our intellectual side. That's stuff. Another way to say that is we access it from the being level, not the intellectual level. So the intuitive side or the being level side, that's the way to access the data. So there's not too many people that are good at it, because in our culture, we don't value the intuitive side much. So we don't really develop it very much. We just develop our intellectual side. But anyway, you asked the question, how did I figure out anything about these databases? Well, I started out this work trying to come up with some theory of how it all worked. That was kind of my job when I started going out to the lab with Dennis and Bob Monroe. So I was always looking for models, and the first thing any scientist does is start reading what was in the past. What did people think about it? So I read everything that I could possibly read about the nature of reality, both metaphysics and physics and everything. And when I did that, I came across these databases, Akashic records. Okay, but at the time, the consensus was, at least from the stuff that I read, the consensus was, and this would be like 19, 70s, 1960s, late 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, that time frame when I was putting all this stuff together. The consensus was that past was still alive and happening, that you could go to that past. You could even reincarnate to the past if you wanted to. You see, that was a viable thing filled of people who were still busy doing things, making choices. Now, that logically didn't make any sense at all. Logically, you say, that's kind of strange, but then people dress it up and, oh, but that's in another dimension. You see, that's in another space. Well, then maybe it's okay, if it's in another dimension, but still logically, it doesn't work very well, because the past was just that past. And as soon as they make different choices, it won't be that past anymore. So then it wouldn't be the past. It would just be another reality frame that's taken off, going off on its own thing. So how could people be there doing things, making choices, and it still be that same old past? You see, it just logically doesn't compute. As soon as that alive past made a single free will choice, it wouldn't be the past anymore. So it wouldn't be our past anymore. It would be another reality frame. So anyway, I thought about that, but that was the going consensus, that this past was some sort of viable place where you could go. You could talk to people who had died. You could go look at history. You could interact with them. You could go back and interact with characters from your youth or from past lives or all sorts of things. You could ask them questions, get answers. That's why people thought that it was still alive, because they could go back there and access information. Okay, so that was my going in thought, but I wanted to test it. So what I did is I went into those databases, and at this point, I'd been doing going into these altered states, accessing data for a long enough time that I was pretty good at it and could be very consistent with it. So I would go into a past database, and I would interact with the people there. This is that I'd get into the movie. You can watch the movie, you can be in the movie, or you can just get data about it. You have different ways you can different levels you can access it. So I was a get into the movie at this point, and I would interact with people, and then I'd watch and see how those interactions played out. It's like that old thing about where you have 20 people in a big circle, and you whisper something to one and they whisper it all the way around. By the time you get to the end, it's garbled, it's something entirely different. Well, that's because people make free will choices, and people don't have perfect hearing, and they're different every time, every second of the day. You see things a little differently. Your own sense, your own intuition, your own feelings change and come and go all the time. So people are just different. So I could come into this reality frame, and I'd interject something. I'd put in something that would affect the people there that I was interacting with. I'd give them some information, or I'd do something and see how they would react. And what I found out is that if I would do the same thing, they would react exactly the same way. And I could follow that for 4 or 5 chains. In other words, I do something that would cause them to react, and then somebody else would react to their reaction, and then somebody else would react to that person's reaction. So that's what I mean by chain. You can do things that affect people that affect other people, and you can see how that spreads out. People affect each other. That's how our life is, right? We do things and it affects other people. So I watched that, and my thought was that if this was a real ongoing place, each time I did that, I'd get a different answer. The people affecting people, affecting people, affecting people. It's like going around that circle, whispering the word in somebody's ear. It would come out differently, but it didn't. It came out exactly the same way every time, to the exact detail. So I probably spent, I don't know, 6 months doing this kind of research. And I could go there and interact with it and do this, but I needed to be able to do the same thing in the exact same position and see the differences that it would make, or the differences it didn't make. So unless you have precision getting around in these databases, then you wouldn't be able to do this. But if you do have precision, you could go to that same moment. So, that the idea that you could go to a same moment kind of made it sound like it was a fixed. That same moment was part of the history. So it was fixed. I could go to that same moment. That same moment didn't keep changing. That same moment was there because it was part of a history I knew of, that I knew that had happened. So I go to that point, but now I do something to change it. And I got reactions from all those people. They reacted to what I did. I may have jumped up on the table and started to, do the polka or something, do something that other people would react to. And I'd get that same reaction, and they'd say something, and then somebody else would say something, which would be a comment to that comment, and somebody else would comment to the comment to the comment, and it was that kind of thing. So I would do those things over and over and over again, to where if it's science, you have to be repeatable, and it has to be something that's steady. It can't be different every time you do it. So after a while, I came to the conclusion that it wasn't alive. It was just information. It was history. It was a database with information in it, and wasn't anymore. Even though you could go there and talk to your dead Uncle Fred, it was just database information. Then I learned that I could go have different kinds of intents. If the default intent is to give the highest, whatever the most likely thing is that they would do, they would react. And that's what plays out for everybody. You get their most likely thing. So if I say something to my dead Uncle Fred, he'll respond in a way that would be the highest probability that that's the way he would respond. And then if somebody else responds to him, it'd be the highest way. So that's the default way the database works. But you can go into it, and I practice this too. After I come to the conclusion it's a database, then I want to test the database and say, how does the database work? So I went into it with an intent, and it says I don't want the first or the highest probability reaction. I want the 10th highest probability reaction. And I notice that some things were pretty similar, because the probability of something may be very broad. There may be almost an equal probability of various things happening. So in that case, you're likely to get all kinds of different things. But sometimes the probability of happening is very high, and other responses are very low. So then you get a dramatic difference there, rather than subtle differences that you might get if there were a whole lot of very similar things that had about the same probability. So going through this, I realized that I could make a difference. I would say things and get a different reaction if I had a different intent as to what the probability was. I want their 10th most likely probability. And now when I'd say something, I'd get a different response. And I get a different response. And I'd get a different response. And sometimes I'd get a real similar response, because the 10th one wasn't really that much difference than the first one, because the first 100 possibilities were all very similar to each other. So you get a response that was almost the same, but maybe slightly different, and maybe you couldn't even discern much difference. And other times you get more. So I realized then that this database was there. We could query it. We needed to specify in our query what we wanted to see, what we wanted to do. And the reason for keeping the probability, the data other than just a history thread, all that probable information, was because with that, you could do what if analysis. You could go and you can do what if analysis. So let's say I want to know, what would my life have been like if I married Susie instead of Sally? Well, I can go to the database. I can go to that point where I choose to marry Susie and not Sally. And that was now my history, because I did marry Susie and not Sally. So I can go back to that point and change it and say, no, I'm going to marry Sally this time. How would that work out? Then you can lead through that, but you don't want every detail, because that's not interesting. You want, let's say, I'll take this in every 5 years. So I want to see some little vignette, some little movie that shows me kind of the sense of the relationship, gives me the, kind of where we are and what we're doing. Maybe it's only a 2 or 3 minute video, but it kind of captures the sense of what's going on in our life. And I want one of those for every 5 years. So let's progress 5 years, and now what would life be like with Sally? All right, I see that, and I might ask some questions. Yeah, but what about this? How many kids did we have? I could ask some questions then. I'd get those answers. And then I might say, well, let's go to the next 5 years. And I may do that up through, say, 30 years, 40 years. And then I might jump to the end and say, well, let's go right up, to the end. What was it like when I died in that reality where I was married to Sally? And how did Sally react to that? After I died, how did she get over it? So you can get all this probable information, you see, future probable and past probable, all of the stuff. And it's not necessarily what would have actually happened. It's just what would likely happen.
So these things are learning tools. They're a vehicle for learning.
Mm-hmm.
If you
Yes.
are adept at this. Was there anything in any of these databases, the past or the unactualized past or future probable, that was particularly significant for you? Did you, I remember in one of Bob Monroe's books, and I don't know if this is when you were with him or not, but he would gather occasionally with some of his past some of his past life experiences, and discover things or question things. Have you ever done that? And did you know what he might have learned from that?
No, I didn't do those similar things. Bob was getting information about evolution and how we evolve, how we start with a lower quality of consciousness, evolve and get higher quality of consciousness as we go. And he was getting that information. And so here's where you were then, here's where you are now, here's where you're going, this is what you're growing toward. So he got that sort of information that was telling him about this being a consciousness evolution trainer, if you will. That's what this reality was all about. That's what consciousness was all about. So that was the kind of information he was getting, and he got that in the form of meeting these other selves, you see. So it wasn't so much that Bob met these other selves as it was that was the way the information was given to him. That's how he interpreted it, because the information may have said something like, well, here's you 20 years ago. Now here's you now. Now here's you 20 years from now. Well, you can interpret that lots of different ways. Bob interpreted it as meeting himself in those different things. You could have interpreted it as a vision of you, of you in the future. It may have been a different way to interpret it. So the interpretation was Bob's own. But what he learned from it was something about the evolution, growing up, the interaction between the various yous, and then he I think he got some of those connections that span not just his lifetime but spanned other lifetimes, where he met himself from other, as he progressed in other lifetimes. So all of that was him learning about the nature of reality, growth, evolution, spanning many lifetimes, and we change, and so on. So he saw he saw that one being. I don't think it was, I can't remember the name he gave it, but it was kind of the very advanced being who had been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, and was a professor at colleges, and he'd kind of teleport to where he worked and do his thing, you know, that very advanced person. So that was Bob getting the information about the possibilities. What could you become? What are the possibilities? So he gets that and he puts it into a context that makes it more concrete. Oh, I met Sam, you know, and had a long chat with Sam, and he told me about the things he did and what he did. Well, that's the context that he puts it in when he gets the information. So when you read books or information, or even talk to somebody who's telling you about their experiences in inner space, then you have to look at what they say as metaphorical. Look at the underlying meaning in it, not just literally what's being said. But we have a habit of taking everything literally, because in this very tight rule set virtual reality we're in, everything's pretty literal. And we tend to treat everything that way, but it's really not that way. You have to look at it. Dreams are the same way. When you interpret dreams, you don't say, oh, I saw so-and-so in my dream. Well, that so-and-so, that wasn't necessarily that personality. It was just that personality represented a kind of person. It's that sort of thing. That person, I saw Joe in a dream and he did this and that. Well, it's not necessarily about Joe. Joe is just a metaphor for a person who served the point that Joe did in his dream. So it's like that. It tends to be metaphorical. Well, that's because you have to interpret data. You get data and you have to interpret it. It's your interpretation that is your reality. You see? So Bob's reality of what he saw was his interpretation. So we don't take that literally. Now, sometimes you can have an interpretation that's very literal. Sometimes things are like that, but sometimes you don't. Most of the times you don't. Sometimes you can have dreams that are very literal, but most of the time you don't. Most of the time they're metaphorically. So a literal thing is not impossible. It's just not typical. It's not the standard thing. It happens, but mostly you have to look at the big picture of the meaning behind it.
Now, all of your experiences with testing these databases showed you that the past is not as it was in the 70s, thought to be existing all at once. And you discovered that because of the repeated experiments you did, and this led you to realize that there was no free will
in that database.
In the database.
Right.
And the future probable, not set in stone, was a way to show you how you can evolve in a positive way, how your choices could make a difference in a positive way.
Right. You can do that future probable database, just like the example I gave of marrying Susie or Sally. You can say, okay, I have a big choice coming up. Now, if I make this choice, what's likely to happen? 5 years, another 5 years, another 5 years. Where does that choice lead me? And if I make the other choice, where does that lead me? And it can show you the possibilities. What's likely. That is, if your intent is to see the most likely thing. If your intent is not that, then you may skip through that database not seeing what's most likely. So you need to have that intent to make sure you get what's likely. Typically, though, that's the default if you don't have any intention on it at all. But yes, you can use that to kind of have an idea how things might go. But you have to always make your own choices. You can't use the excursions in the probable future database to make all your choices for you. That would be, you'd start getting bad data, or you'd start getting locked out, because that's not the point. The point to be here is to make choices and grow up from those choices, make the best choices you can. So even though you look through something, you still have to think about it and say, well, okay, given that all that's possible, what choice do I have to make? Because that's never what's necessarily going to happen. It's just possible. and you could make different choices that make all of that stuff have to change. Yeah.
What advice can you give to people who are stuck in the past, bad choices? What, in terms and in light of what you've discovered and what you've experimented with, could you advise people how to let go of the past and how to perhaps use the future probability to make better choices?
Well, first of all, they'd have to come to a very deep conclusion that they needed a change in perspective. They needed to change something. So if their life, you said these were people of kind of people with problems, people with issues, people who are suffering, people who have pain, you'd first have to come to the conclusion that most of this pain and suffering was basically created by yourself. It has to do with your attitudes and your feelings. It has to do with, with how you are, your fears. That's what makes you unhappy. That's what creates most of your pain. So if you don't realize that, then nothing else is going to work. Everything else will just fall by the wayside no matter what you try. So you have to realize that almost all of your troubles are self-created. So the reason you're unhappy is because you have beliefs and you have fears and you are self-focused and self-centered, and it's all that stuff is what causes you to be unhappy, to be miserable, to have pain. And I know most people who have trouble, they'll say, oh no, it's not me, it's them. It's my wife or my husband or my children or my dog that makes me unhappy. I'd be real happy if they just do what I want them to do. Well, that is not the case. The fact that you can't be happy unless they do what you want them to tells you right away that you're very self-centered. It has to be your way, and you're that way, you're self-centered because you have fear. If you don't take charge and manipulate and what's the right word, gain control of the situation, then it would be terrible. So you need to control things and make things come out the right way, which is the way you want them to come out. So all of that stuff leads to fear that it won't be right, fear that it'll all go to hell in a handbasket if you relinquish control, fear that your children will grow up and be awful if they don't do it your way. All those fears tend to make us turn into control freaks, where we have to have it our way because of course we know best. That's just, everybody feels like they know best. Everybody feels like they know more, and all the people disagree with them just don't understand, or they're stupid. That's the way every single person feels, no matter how brilliant or how uneducated or educated or bright or stupid they are. They all feel the same way, which is why we have so much quarreling and struggling in the world, because everybody's trying to manipulate everybody else to do it their way. And that just makes it not work for anyone. So if you're in that kind of a life where your life is kind of a soap opera, you're unhappy, things are unpleasant, you don't live in a world of joy and peace and tranquility and satisfaction, then you're creating the dissatisfaction and the pain and the stress by who you are, by being who you are. And if you want to change that, if you want to get rid of it and find that joy and peace and happiness, you have to change who you are. So that's the first commitment. And if you can't get to step one, that's step one, then there isn't anything you're going to do to change it. You're just going to continue to make the same choices based on the same fears, and it's just going to go on and on and on. So if you get to the point that you realize that you are the problem, not pointing your finger at everybody else, but you are the problem, and that only you can make the changes. And you have to make those changes and find that happiness and peace, regardless of what else is going on in the world, regardless of what your life, the rest of your environment is like. You have to do that. And instead of throwing up your hands and saying, oh, well, that's impossible. I live in this terrible situation and it'd just be impossible to do anything than miserable here. no matter what I did, however I changed my attitudes, this is just a really bad place to be in. Well, that's really not the case. If you change yourself, it will be something that you will learn from, something that isn't so terrible, even if it's hard, even if it hurts. I don't mean that there are no really tough situations that won't, that will make you sad. There's going to be lots of situations that will make you very sad. But if you don't have the fear, you deal with them in a very positive way. And the sadness then doesn't turn into pain, doesn't turn into misery and upset and stress. It's just sad. And you accept it and you go on, and your life is still full of joy and peace and tranquility, even though you're sad sometimes, because people that you love continue to hurt themselves and each other, and that's sad. But other than that, you can deal with that, accept it is the way it is, and let it go. So you don't carry that around as a burden. You don't carry your sadness around as a burden. It's just a fact of life. Like some days it rains, some days the sun shines. You don't carry the days that it rains around as a burden. You just accept them and go on, and that's okay. Well, so step one, realize you're the problem. Step two, look at your feelings. Look at your thoughts and your feelings, and notice every time you think or feel something that is negative. And negative means, are you stressed? That's negative. Are you complaining? That's negative. Are you feeling sorry for yourself? That's negative. Are you annoyed? Are you unhappy? Do you feel like you're not appreciated? Do you feel like you're a failure? You're not doing it right. You're inadequate. All these things. You feel like it's unfair. The world isn't being fair to you. All of that's negative feelings. All of that comes from fear and belief. That's where all that negative stuff comes from. So as soon as you find a negative thought and a negative feeling, trace that back to the fear. Ask yourself, why is that a problem? Okay, and you will find a fear. And once you find the fear, then you can start to have an intention to not be that way. Now, it's very important you get the difference between an intention to not be that way and an intention to not act that way. Because we don't want to just become better actors. We want to become better people. So we have to have an intention not to have that fear, not to be that way. So when somebody says something we take as an insult, well, then we have to not act by being angry and throwing insults back at them, because that just makes us upset, gives us stress. So we just let that be and realize that it's about them, that other person. If they insult you, well, it's not about you, it's about them. Accept it. That's the way they are. They're doing the best they can with what they have, trying to grow up in their own way. And you just let it be, just like the rain. You don't get obsessed with it. You don't, fuss over it. You just accept that that's the way they are. And then you go on and deal with them and however you have to. Maybe they're a coworker, maybe they're a spouse or a child or somebody you have to deal with. You can't just walk away. Then you deal with them positively, not negatively. So now it's no longer your negativity feeding their negativity, which feeds your negativity, which feeds their negativity. And it just keeps going like that everybody's miserable. So that's the thing you do. Step one, realize you're the problem. Step two, look for any negativity, any negative feelings in your life, trace them back to the fear, have an intent not to be that way. And it can't be just an intellectual intent. You have to really want to not be that way. Rather than what we do is if we find fears normally, we tend to justify them. Oh, well, of course I feel hurt. Of course I got angry. Who wouldn't get angry, about that? Anybody that didn't get angry would be dead, Anger is the right response. I need to show them that makes me angry. That's the way we justify it. So we justify our bad behavior and our bad choices. And instead of justifying them, we need to accept them, that's the way we are and that's the way we respond. But we can choose to be different. We don't have to act negatively. We can act positively. We can deal with the problem rather than just throw gasoline on it, gasoline on that fire, which is what we do when we get angry. We just make everything worse. So we can actually defuse it. We can put water on that fire, instead of throwing more gasoline on it. But we can only do that if we're not angry.
Well, thank you, Tom. This is just some of the many aspects of why your my big toe theory and your way of looking at things as a virtual reality concept with the purpose of lowering entropy and growing towards love can help us these days. And that was a very interesting discussion. And I thank you very much.
Well, you're very welcome, Donna. It's always a pleasure talking with you.